If you browse through the comment section of almost any furry-related video, you'll see the usual array of supportive messages and memes. But every so often, you'll come across something completely different. A simple "God bless" or "praying for you" nestled between the typical responses. These quiet expressions of faith hint at something that doesn't get talked about very often: the religious furries who navigate both their spiritual beliefs and their love for anthropomorphic art. I was curious about this topic because religion and the fandom intersect in ways that most people don't realize, creating communities within communities that face unique challenges and find their own paths to balance faith with furriness. To help me understand this better, I've reached out to NeoTheFolf, a Muslim furry who shared some really insightful perspectives about what it's like being religious in this predominantly secular space. But before we dive into his experience, let me give you some context about where religion fits into the broader furry community. So, when researchers from Fur Science surveyed thousands of furries about their religious beliefs, they found some pretty interesting patterns. About 1/3 of furries flat out identified as either atheist or agnostic, making the fandom significantly more secular than the general population. Around 25% identified as Christian, though many noted they didn't regularly attend church or actively practice their faith. What stood out to me was that while most furries don't consider themselves religious, they're actually just as likely to be spiritual as they are to be non-spiritual, suggesting there's this interesting divide between organized religion and personal spirituality that plays out in unique ways within the community. The remaining percentages included about 11% who identified as pagan, shaman, or Wiccan, with Jewish furries, Muslim furries, and Buddhist furries representing much smaller minorities. Despite the fandom's secular lean, religious communities within it are surprisingly organized and active. Christian furries have established groups like Christian Furry Fellowship, which holds regular Saturday services complete with hymns and fellowship sessions, while major furry conventions often feature religious meetups. Believe it or not, there's even been a Jewish furries panel at Furpocalypse. What I found particularly interesting is how animal symbolism in religious traditions actually dovetails quite naturally with furry interests. Christian furries often reference biblical animal imagery, with some depicting Jesus as an anthropomorphic lion similar to C.S. Lewis's Aslan. This creates a bridge between their spiritual beliefs and their artistic interests that feels authentic rather than forced. This brings us to NeoTheFolf's perspective as a Muslim furry, which really opened my eyes to the specific challenges religious minorities face within the fandom. He mentioned that it's genuinely difficult to find other Muslims in the community, which makes sense given that the past furry surveys have only found a very small number of Muslim respondents. What struck me about his experience is how he's developed his own framework for staying halal within the fandom, setting personal rules about which servers he can join and which activities he participates in, while still finding ways to engage meaningfully with the community. His persona itself represents this balance, outwardly appearing as a cyberpunk-styled Folf without obvious religious markers, but with deeper lore that incorporates his faith. He shared that he actually enjoys discussing his religion and teaching others about Islam, but mentioned encountering some awkward assumptions from other furries. The kind of, is it true that people are forced to do this or that questions that came from genuine curiosity mixed with misconceptions. One of the most telling things NeoTheFolf mentioned was the lack of representation and dedicated spaces for Muslim furries specifically, and religious furries more broadly. While there's a Muslim furs group on Fur Affinity with about 60 members and some scattered Telegram chats, these communities remain quite small and are sometimes hard to find. The platform he mentioned, eFur, which isn't present on Discord highlights how religious furries sometimes end up on alternative platforms, where they feel more comfortable expressing both sides of their identity without judgment, though this can also contribute to their relative invisibility within mainstream furry spaces. The tension between religious belief and furry fandom isn't always dramatic, but it can create some interesting dynamics. There are documented cases of furries attending church services during conventions, particularly amusing at events in places like Utah, where you'll apparently see people in fursuits chatting with attendees in white shirts and ties who just came back from Sunday morning services. Some religious furries report feeling like they need to keep their faith somewhat private to avoid potential backlash from a community that's overwhelmingly LGBTQ and progressive. However, most accounts suggest that as long as religious furries aren't using their beliefs to condemn or exclude others, the community is generally tolerant of different spiritual perspectives. What comes through most clearly in NeoTheFolf's experience and in accounts from other religious furries is this idea of finding personal harmony between different aspects of their identity. He specifically mentioned feeling most at peace when he encounters other Muslims in the fandom. That sense of "you are not alone in here" that validates both parts of his identity simultaneously. The furry fandom's emphasis on self-expression and acceptance of diverse identities actually creates space for this kind of nuanced approach to belonging, even when someone's religious beliefs might seem at odds with the community's prevailing cultural attitudes. So, after looking into all of this, I think what this exploration reveals is how much more complex religious identity in niche communities can be than outside stereotypes suggest. The narrative that you can't be both religious and a furry misses the reality of how most religious community members actually engage with the space. NeoTheFolf's approach of treating his religion and his furry interests as complementary rather than competing parts of his identity seems to be fairly typical. Religious furries generally aren't trying to make the fandom more religious, they're just trying to participate authentically while maintaining their personal spiritual commitments. Anyway, the real challenge seems to be visibility and representation. When religious minorities within the fandom are this small and scattered, it becomes harder for people like NeoTheFolf to find others who share both interests, which can make the experience feel more isolating than it needs to be. I'd love to know what you think about all of this in the comment section below, or you can start a conversation on my Discord server at dsc.gg/skykes. And with that, I hope you all have a fantastic day.